On today's episode of the podcast, we'll be looking back at the 2010s, the figures, events and politics that defined this decade, and asking, why did the left's aspirations for revolution during the 2010s fall short? It was a decade that many hoped would usher in a new era of leftist revolutions. Yet as we look back, the question looms large. What went wrong? I was joined by Will Davies, writer and professor in political economy at Goldsmiths University of London, who wrote an essay for the New Statesman published in January titled The 2010s, a Decade of Revolutionaries Without a Revolution. Will's essay opens with a description of Russell Brand's evolution from lewd celebrity figure to left-wing activist and eventually now online conspiracy theorist. But how did Brand's shifting roles reflect broader changes in the political and cultural landscape of this period? You open your essay by describing Russell Brand's evolution from lewd celebrity figure to left-wing activist and eventually now online conspiracy theorist. You gave an interview to Tucker Carlson, right? How did Brand's shifting roles reflect broader changes in the political and cultural landscape?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I guess the first thing to say about Brand is that anything we say about him in retrospect has now been overshadowed by the allegations of the last 6 months or so, and that has to be recognised. And I think that we have to be cautious in how we handle his legacy in light of that. I think that the interesting thing about Brand, to me, when thinking particularly about this conjuncture of the post-financial crisis period, what broadly you could look at as a period that lasted between the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the autumn of 2008 and the initial lockdowns related to COVID-19 in early 2020. We know he became famous through things like Big Brother. He was a TV celebrity. I mean, in some ways, a lot of the figures who ended up dominating the 2010s in politics had careers in areas such as the media. You think of someone like Boris Johnson. I mean, has a similar sort of charisma, similar kind of status within the media as someone who simply just sort of had to be himself and be witty and somehow sort of drew attention towards himself. And that was obviously the Brand pre-2008 Brand. I think the interesting thing about that decade, and this is why I used Brand to try and encapsulate something, was that one of the reasons he first gained attention as a political figure was with his interview with Jeremy Paxman on Newsnight, in which he said, really, there's no point in voting. As I point out in the article, statistically, this wasn't actually a particularly unusual thing to certainly to do. I mean, turnouts in general elections had been falling since 1997. The 2001 election was a historically low turnout. So you could say that roughly a third of the electorate had already made up their minds that it wasn't worth voting by the time that Brand gave that interview with Paxman. The reason it drew so much attention was that he was expressing something about the failings of representative democracy, the limits of the electoral system that suddenly seemed kind of charismatic, mobilizing, energizing in certain ways. And then he said, in the wake of that interview, he said, really, the only thing that will work right now is a revolution. And again, looking back on it, in some ways it looks rather kind of embarrassing that this would have been seen as such a kind of an exciting or incendiary thing to say. And I mean, the New Statesman has its own kind of role in this, in inviting him to guest edit an issue, which was, I think, all about revolution. Mm-hmm. And then he wrote a book called Revolution, which was a big bestseller. The language of revolution hadn't been used very much over the kind of pre-financial crisis era. But in particular, this sort of recognition that there was a gap between what the people, in the kind of populist jargon, might want or need, and what was expressed via the voting system, was suddenly gaining this kind of extremely charismatic expression. And of course, we then saw all sorts of manifestations of that over subsequent years via Brexit and Corbynism and that sort of thing. But I think that he saw which way the wind was blowing, let's say.
But it's also a class issue, right? You cite Mark Fisher in your essay, talking about that interview as sort of the first time ever or in years that he sees somebody from a working class background being given the platform to win an argument against a sort of class superior, how Mark Fisher put it.
Yeah, I mean, the Mark Fisher essay, which became notorious and something that I think in many ways, whether he regretted it, it certainly led to a lot of difficult relationships in various areas. And it's also then got picked up by people I think that Mark Fisher would have been appalled by as sort of, a critique of cancel culture and wokeism and this sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, in that essay, the Exiting the Vampire's Castle, he celebrated Russell Brand as being this example of someone who was proudly working class, proclaiming various truths that some kind of elite cartel of both, which engulfs both the media and Westminster, had previously shut out in various ways. And that was something which Mark Fisher was arguing, as you say, on a class basis, that this was giving voice to something that previously had been there, but it had been silent. And it's true that if you're thinking about disengagement from democracy, the people who were withdrawing from the voting system, from elections over previous years and decades, tended to be the young and the working class. The New Labour whether New Labour is responsible for it is a more complicated question, but it's certainly the 1997, 2001, 2005 elections coincided with a fairly dramatic drop in electoral turnouts in the UK. And of course, part of the excitement around the Brexit referendum of 2016 was that suddenly there was this massive upsurge in participation in democracy all over again, which is why Brexiteers to this day say this was, in statistical terms, the biggest mandate that any political platform had ever had in the UK.
So what do you think? Obviously, the left kind of in the 2010s embraced Russell Brand. Ed Miliband, famously in the 2015 election did a major interview with Brand on his YouTube channel, and obviously he was involved in protests and things like that. How do you explain what motivated the left's sort of association with Brand?
Well, I mean, we know that if we go back to that kind of, the first half of the 2010s, so you've got, the coalition winning power in May 2010, introducing an austerity program. You've got the protests against tuition fees happening at the end of that year, and then those fees kicked in a couple of years later. So you had a drastic kind of delimiting of what was considered possible. I mean, the other important expression which happened around about then was, Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, which I think was published in 2009. It was short, it was very readable. It brought into questions the affective state of neoliberalism in relation to his own depression and some of the cultural manifestations of sort of a depressive culture, which says that the future has to be exactly the same or worse than the present. And that was what, so much of Mark's writing over that period was about. What partly was being mobilized there was a generational phenomenon, and I think that's partly what Mark Fisher helped to give some voice to. But I think it also, in different ways, it was partly the Brand, we call it a coalition, but certainly the kind of moment of excitement that here was all sorts of people that felt that they didn't really have any kind of voice at all, and that, of course, the mechanism of the mainstream media and mainstream politics were not serving them in various ways. Now, one of the crucial ingredients in that, which is I discuss at some length in the essay, was that in the past, if there were various people who felt that they had no means of expressing their alienation from the mainstream media or mainstream politics, other than becoming pamphleteers, which of course, some people did via kind of anarchist book fairs and that kind of thing, or writing letters to the newspaper, you didn't really have any other media with which to express that alienation. Social media, which came of age during this period. I mean, I think I got a Facebook account in 2007 and a smartphone in 2010. What they did and do so kind of with such unique capacity is to give voice to the discrepancy between the account of the world as given by the mainstream, in inverted commas, and how the mainstream feels to millions of people. And that's something which, various anthropologists and theorists and ethnographers and sociologists have been interested in that for a long time. But the idea that people themselves are able to basically mobilize and say that system over there, I guess anti-war protests, which I kind of come onto at the end of the essay. If you think of the Iraq protests of 2003, one of the most kind of frequently seen banners and signs in those protests is "Not in my name." And again, there's that idea of that what is done via the media and the institutions of representation of the mainstream, they do not reflect me in any way. I am outside of that system of representation. And that's what I think social media does so powerfully. It's what Brand was picking up on. I think Ed Miliband sort of dabbled with it in 2015 because I think he thought it might win him some crucial votes for that election, which we know he ultimately, although relatively narrowly, lost.
And it's an expression of, this is not in my name, that's much more direct than voting for a party that might or might not go with your position.
I mean, there was obviously the Liberal Democrats in 2010.
Yeah, who let everybody down on that front. You alluded to the rise of big tech there, talking about social media companies. How do you, in the essay, you talk about the fact that the financial crash and the rise of big tech, it's not a coincidence, they're related. Can you explain that connection?
When we look back historically on that period, the global financial crisis began in the summer of 2007. The banks were being still sort of stabilized and bailed out over 2009, and then you get the austerity period coming into 2010. We've already mentioned roughly what the sort of historical contours of the kind of big tech moment were, but they were sort of around about that period. I mean, one of the ways in which governments around the world, but I guess most importantly in this case the United States government, responded to the global financial crisis was to basically try and sort of drown the financial system in extremely cheap credit through slashing interest rates to historically unprecedented low levels, but then also quantitative easing that was introduced to try and push interest rates down even further. So the central bank is purchasing assets off pension funds, putting money that it has effectively created itself into the bank accounts of those pension funds, so that there is such a surplus of credit within the banking system that banks are starting to lend more. Now, what they can't do is ensure that the banks are actually lending to kind of productive entities such as, manufacturing firms or new infrastructure projects or, wind farms or sort of things which might actually have been kind of welcome uses for all of that very cheap credit over the 2010s. So a lot of it ended up going into real estate and the price of housing and so on went up and that kind of thing. But this extremely cheap credit was crucial in the development of platform business models such as, Uber and this sort of thing, who actually offered no profits whatsoever, indefinitely, basically. So one of the way in which they could approach their finances was to effectively say, we have this plan where we're just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and everyone else is going to invest into us over time because it's so obvious that the future sort of belongs to us. That the price of the shares that you're going to buy, the amount of money that we're going to make financially, not necessarily through the profit of the business itself, will be enough to pay you back. So this very, very cheap credit enabled tech companies to grow without having to actually offer any profits in return. And I mean, Amazon, I can't remember exactly when Amazon first returned a profit, but it was able to attract vast quantities of equity investment from the, I guess, mid-1990s onwards. And the profits came much, much later than that. Now, that obviously wasn't during the period of this ultra-cheap credit and quantitative easing, but I mean, one of the interesting features of platform business models is that in order to function, they have to get to a very, very large scale very quickly. Uber wouldn't work if only a few people had it and there were only a few drivers, or it was only in one place but not in another place. Part of the way it works is to get very, very big as quickly as it possibly can. And to do that, it needs very large amounts of capital. And it was that period after the global financial crisis, when when capital was struggling to find good returns because interest rates were so low that you couldn't, simply putting your money into a bank was not going to earn you returns. So all of these other forms of what are potentially riskier investment became more rational to engage in.
The convergence of these particular events that we just discussed, the crash, the rise of big tech, led to the emergence of figures like Brand calling for a revolution, but it also led to the rise of populism, as sort of a political term. Everybody's describing everything as sort of populist politics. Somebody who isn't frequently branded as a populist, but whose politics fit the definition is Jeremy Corbyn, who you discuss in your essay. First, how did populism become the word du jour, as you put it? And was it overused, do you think, describing everyone from Trump to Johnson?
There is a kind of scholarly literature on populism. And one of the books that I discuss in the essay is The Populist Moment by Arthur Borriello and Anton Jaeger, which is a really excellent overview of this decade, what they call the long 2010s. I mean, within the scholarly literature, populism is a style of rhetoric. Actually, it's a way of addressing, trying to construct a people in the kind of political theory of this by drawing a moralistic distinction between the people who are considered to be kind of ordinary and decent, and the elite who are considered to be self-interested, corrupt, and sort of alien or foreign in some way. And this has all sorts of manifestations in history, and it has some, I think, quite a lot of quite obvious anti-Semitic potential where it's been used in various ways to refer to certain minorities who are acting in a conspiratorial manner and exploiting this ordinary nation. I think that styles of populist rhetoric, I mean, if you see it purely as a mode of rhetoric, you can spot it in nearly any political speech, in fact. I mean, Thatcher was described as an authoritarian populist by Stuart Hall in the early 1980s. Blair, when he described the forces of conservatism in his famous conference speech, that was, viewed as being kind of brilliant example of populist rhetoric.
For this 21st century will not be about the battle between capitalism and socialism, but between the forces of progress and the forces of conservatism.
He was kind of referring to simultaneously the kind of trade unions and kind of, I guess, various other aspects of the establishment, but cleverly and not coincidentally was also referring to the name of the opposition party. So he was sort of lumping together various people who were sort of bad versus him and everyone who was on the side of modernity is good. So rhetoric, it works quite, you can see it in all sorts of ways.
And Hillary Clinton did it less well with the basket of deplorables.
Oh God, yeah.
The wrong way around.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was, I guess, that was a speech she probably never expected to see light of day, I guess, which, but and I don't think she ever thought they were the elite anyway. But I mean, obviously Clinton herself was a kind of victim of populist kind of line drawing, where her speeches for Goldman Sachs and her association with Wall Street and Washington and Bill Clinton and so on was just sort of damned her in many people's eyes. I think what happened in the 2010s was that there were various startup parties like Podemos and Syriza and these sorts of parties that came along, and of course various manifestations of Farage startup activities. In a way, the appetite for populism, I suppose, in that instance arose because many people had, as Brand had expressed, had come to see the mainstream political parties themselves as the elite. So that the media are all part of it, the mainstream political parties are all part of it. Curiously, often big business and finance was not part of it, which is partly why I think often left populism has struggled so much over this period. Is that, I mean, I mentioned that Jeremy Corbyn's 2019 manifesto launch was all about sort of that he was gunning for these billionaires, that there's I can't remember how many it was 150 billionaires or something in the country, and he was coming for them.
The billionaires and the super rich, the tax dodgers, the bad bosses and the big polluters, they own the Conservative Party, but they don't own us. They don't own the Labour Party.
And this was, again, an attempt at classic kind of populist rhetoric. The other thing which is, I think, worth saying about populist rhetoric, which in some ways makes it tricky terrain for the traditional left, is that the people within this political register are not defined by class. So it's not about the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, as in a Marxist sense. The people would include the traditional proletariat working class, but they would also include aspects of the petty bourgeoisie and various other, and right-wing populism, of course, would also throw in all sorts of other
Donald Trump, a very wealthy businessman.
Very rich people who are sort of, but they still eat burgers and sort of you'd have a beer with them, sort of thing. So it's never mapped cleanly onto class divisions, which has always made some parts of the left rather uncomfortable with it. And Corbyn was flirted with populist rhetoric at various times. I remember there were certain sort of pieces of online video content that were released. There was one very effective one called something like Our Town or something, where it was an image of someone sort of walking around a kind of deindustrialized town where everything was boarded up and there used to be jobs.
These streets were once full of spirit and hope. A proud community where an honest day's work could earn you a decent day's pay. Years of austerity have ripped the heart out of this place. But that's just part of the story.
You know, and it was trying to suggest that the problem was, yes, it was the kind of political and elites, but it was also a problem with a certain model of capitalism, and that there were certain problems with, you know, the fact that, you know, there was money around, but it had all ended up in certain kind of, you know, industries in London and so on. So I think that was the thing. It was a sort of, you know, a gross failure to treat the financial crisis from the perspective of social justice, because nobody was willing to really, in the mainstream, talk about the fact that the financial crisis had involved a bailout of, you know, hundreds of billions of pounds for a sector that seemed to have just instantly recovered. Meanwhile, you know, tuition fees, stagnant wages, stagnant productivity growth, local government on its knees, cuts to disability benefit, you know, all of this stuff was going on during that first half of the decade. And it then, I think, really erupted from about 2015 onwards.
What sort of a hold do you think Jeremy Corbyn's brand of populism held on the UK in the 2010s?
Well, I mean, so first of all, there was the 2017 election, which was this kind of moment of, which was one of the many events in that kind of second half of the decade, which people were just sort of like, what the hell just happened? I think people were staggered by it, including people who were some of his most devout supporters. So that demonstrated that there was, you know, in some ways a style of politics where one isn't constantly looking over one's shoulder worrying about how it's going to be represented, which I'm afraid is kind of what Keir Starmer is currently doing. I mean, you could say it's working very well with his 20-point lead in the polls, but he's, you know, everything he's doing is with one eye on the press and on how the Conservatives are going to represent it. And in a way, I think Corbyn won some credit in that election for not being like that. And I think there's a certain respect. Even people who disagree with someone think, well, actually, at least you know who you are and what you believe. And I think that was something that many populist figures of that period won votes for. Many people would say, if you look at what was in the manifestos in 2017 and 2019, how radical was it really? I mean, it wasn't as fiscally radical as many people would have liked on the left. In some ways, I think what many people were hungry for was someone who was going to stand up and morally denounce things. And I think there was a sense in which, you know, enough is enough. How long can we go on? We've now had sort of, you know, 5 or, you know, you could arguably sort of say 7 years if you included the sort of fallout from the financial crisis of these indefensible economic policies. And I think that partly the hunger for someone who will just simply sort of name certain things and recite certain truths. And of course, you know, obviously Corbyn himself came to prominence on the back of his foreign policy positions, not on the back of his domestic policy positions. So of course, you know, someone who had developed a reputation for standing on platforms denouncing things, mainly in relation to defence policies and military interventions, you know, already had the sort of rhetorical kind of wherewithal to go around saying, well, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong. I think that, you know, there were some really interesting people around John McDonnell and some of the ideas around corporate governance reform and trying to think critically about British capitalism and the power of rent seeking and this sort of, you know, like this sort of low productivity kind of highly unequal model that Britain has ended up with. There was a period where that was being critically scrutinised, but I don't think that explains the full scope of Corbyn's kind of, you know, emotional appeal.
We're in very different times when it comes to Labour, obviously, and momentum. And there's an election, and there might be a Labour government. What do you envision for the future of those sort of mass leftist movements here in the UK?
Well, it's hard to say, really. I mean, I think what's going on in relation to Gaza, I think, plays quite a big part, and as it will play probably a bigger part in the United States in relation to the election coming later this year as well. Because I think, you know, one of the things that this remains to be seen, but I mean, it's not clear if how many people will be kind of permanently alienated from voting for parties that have refused to condemn Israel over the last 4 months. So that's one of the unknowns. I think that you know, one of the things that as I discussed in the essay, I mean, you know, so Brand turned into this kind of online conspiracy theorist, and he's used that to try and defend himself against the allegations that were made in the autumn. You know, he gave this interview with Tucker Carlson the other day, which was about, Carlson saying brand is being taken down by the government, and Brand's claiming he's being taken down by big media and big pharma and all this sort of stuff.
Significant attempts to control the information space that are so rigorously adhered to and protected that even what you might imagine to be a marginal voice is considered a significant enough threat to warrant coordinated media attacks.
One of the things I think many of us are sort of trying to grapple with is it's impossible to draw the line between a kind of healthy skepticism towards the mainstream and towards elites. And there are. I mean, whether the term elites is a helpful one or not, but I mean, look at the donor class for the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party, despite being 20% behind in the polls, still out. Is raising more money than the Labour Party, who are, I don't know what the odds are at the moment, but overwhelmingly likely to form the next government of the country. And yet, still these donors are kind of pouring money into the Conservative Party coffers. So there, some sort of cynicism regarding how this sort of thing works is necessary. But who gets called a conspiracy theorist in all of this? So one of the things I think it's not clear, and I think this is in some ways a question for sort of, I guess, digital sociologists, is where has the energy of kind of 2017 era momentum actually gone? I mean, what kinds of online communities has it gone into? What kinds of belief systems and ideologies has it gone into? I mean, there are certain manifestations of that period, like Novara Media. Seems to be going from strength to strength, and I don't think has become any less kind of mainstream in its concerns. It hasn't sort of disappeared off into a kind of Russell Brand type sort of claims about the world, and seems to have a rising number of YouTube followers and that sort of thing. So that may be evidence that actually certain aspects of that sort of post 2010 millennial left remains at least concerned about what happens in Westminster in various ways and hasn't just sort of written it off as a conspiracy in the way that Brand has. I don't know. Again, this is kind of an empirical question. Who are most of Brand's listeners? One of the things we learned during the COVID pandemic was that there's a huge amount of sort of anti-vax sentiment amongst, a lot of the people who were spreading a lot of anti-vax conspiracy theorists were sort of wellness influencers and sort of yoga instructors. And this generationally and demographically, this is probably not the same people who are, necessarily were sort of supporting Jeremy Corbyn. Who knows? I'm sure there were overlaps. There
must be an overlap.
I'm sure there are overlaps. But I think that after all, there are a lot of people who despise Jeremy Corbyn precisely because he, lived in Islington and this sort of thing. But I'm sure, in terms of the sort of vegetarianism and that sort of thing, and also the anti-war mentality, because of course being anti-war has become a much more complicated. I mean, Donald Trump is anti-war. I mean, being anti-war has become much more complicated since in the last decade than it was. Ultimately, I don't really know the answer to your question, but I think clearly Starmer is not worried about losing the support of those sort of swarms, because I think he still looks to 2016 as the Brexit vote as the sort of the moment when the sort of temperature of the country was most kind of acutely taken and of course Brexit was a referendum, not a first past the post electoral system, but it led to this kind of obsession with those red wall seats that I think still continues to shape a lot of what Starmer says about most things, actually.
I wanted to ask you about another horizontal sort of activist movement of the 2010s, which was the Me Too movement, which ended up being kind of largely defined by street protests, marches. Is that another example of a leaderless movement that didn't really achieve anything, do you think? Or is it different to the wider left?
No, I mean, that's interesting. And I think the other thing is thinking about racial politics as well in recent years. I mean, obviously 2020 was the year of the largest street protests the United States has ever seen in relation to, in the context of Black Lives Matter. So the other interesting thing about social media to me is that, so not only does it provide manifestations of kind of affective dispositions that are not going to get written about in the Times or get talked about in Parliament, and yet they now have a media. It also allows for a sort of granularity of politics in terms of being able to identify the politics of things that often get kind of overlooked because they seem to be, somehow sort of too small scale. The right gets very mobilized by the concept of microaggressions and said, it's all just nonsense and so on. But ultimately, the concept of microaggression does mean something. It does refer to something real, which in my own lifetime, I can, think of ways I might have behaved sort of, in a meeting, kind of 15 years ago that I wouldn't behave in terms of being conscious of who is speaking and who is not speaking and these sorts of things. These sorts of things, I'm sure that I was oblivious to things that other people in rooms were aware of 10, 15 years ago, which I'm now more conscious of. And that's obviously partly to do with my, I work in university and it's to do with my sort of demographic profile and that kind of thing. But I think Me Too as well, I don't think Me Too achieved nothing, because I think Me Too created a public representation of something that previously had not had a public representation. And it wasn't trying to represent something that needed to be dealt with by Westminster. I mean, I'm sure there are things that could be dealt with by Westminster, but ultimately it was a demand at the level of sort of granular expressions for a change in relatively granular behaviour in terms of sort of, in workplaces, obviously on public transport, in terms of, this sort of thing. So I think that's somewhat different, because it wasn't something which was aimed to be channeled via the institutions of representative democracy or the representative media necessarily. And so I think it's an interesting one. And I think it was what social media was kind of uniquely capable of enabling, really. It was something that everybody knew, but nobody had been speaking about. Well, let's say half the population knew.
Yeah. And on that, I want to ask you one final question about social media. You talked before about the financial crash and how that was connected to the rise of big tech. And you've got these mass protest movements, the Arab Spring, all sorts of, different movements that are really relying on social media to grow momentum. But of course, social media was sort of the epitome of capitalism and this model that was broken. I just wondered whether you think that was actually a problem for these movements in a way. Were they using these tools of capitalism in order to break it? Or were they were never going to manage to break what they wanted to break and have a revolution, because they were sort of, basically feeding into that system?
When you think about social media and politics in the 2010s, for many people, the first thing they would go to would be the role of Facebook in the Trump election and the Brexit referendum, which is still debated, but it's clearly there was a role there. And so, yes, these things are now part of how campaigns work. I don't think anyone can afford to sort of ignore them altogether. Was there a sort of hypocrisy involved? I mean, in some ways, there was. I mean, I think that. There's this great moment in Vincent Bevins' book where he talks about getting tear gassed in the streets of Sao Paulo and coming home and sort of tweeting some photographs of these violent clashes with police, and then discovering he'd gone viral and making a note to himself in his journal that getting tear gas is great for engagement.
Yeah, the dopamine sort of started.
Yeah, exactly. And I think he also has a very interesting analysis in there about how the smartphone and social media has sort of has created this false impression of power, that it's all about the sort of physical clash, or the physical collision between sort of baton and protester. And of course, there was a lot of people, I mentioned something like Novara Media. I mean, it was formed out of the student protests in 2010 of, people getting kettled and that kind of thing. So there is obviously something quite formative in this sort of affective way of politically of being physically up against each other and being in danger and this sort of stuff.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Will.